Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about some more advanced braking mechanics. Now that we've discussed how to get to the outside Ashigarami situation, and that a Rimi Ashigarami is our vehicle to outside Ashigarami, we can just start an outside Ashigarami now and talk about how we're really going to break somebody's leg. Thus far, I've given you some basic details. I've basically given you a three-part system to work with here. We talked about lever wedges and fulcrum. Okay, we talked about how they're placed along my training partner's legs. Okay, I kind of have two moving parts on my training partner's ankle, where I'm lifting and elevating a heel as I'm pressing toes in towards my training partner's butt. Then I have a middle joint that's being pushed the opposite direction, okay? And then finally I have a hip that's being pinned down, okay? That's incredibly important, okay? Because if the hip isn't pinned down, my training partner can kind of turn and rotate or lift and elevate his hips and move, okay? So we talk about those three parts kind of working together, okay? So let's talk about some advanced braking mechanics that we can apply in these situations. The first thing we'll talk about, we'll start down at the bottom of my training partner's hip, and we'll talk about the way that we can change the way in which we pin our training partner's hip down to possibly increase pressure on our training partner. And you're going to see this throughout different situations in the sport, all right, as a possible way to increase braking pressure in different situations. All right, for the time being, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my feet, okay, and instead of just focusing on back heeling, okay, we're going to take one foot and we're going to step on the other foot, okay? Technically, I can do this on either side, okay? Usually, I do it with my outside leg, stepping over like so. I can also technically put both feet on my training partner's hip, and that would be adequate. The one downside to stepping on my opponent's hip when I have an outside heel hook is it generates a little bit more distance between me and the opponent, okay? Because I have my feet on his hip like so, I might push my training partner into an escape. So when I use this pushing method, this pushing and posting method with my foot, okay, I typically just keep my legs where they normally were locked, and I just step like so. Now, why might I do this, okay? While this is a more secure connection, my legs being locked like so, the step on my own shin or my own ankle provides an ability now for me to press off of my training partner. If you ever went to a weightlifting gym, okay, and you were to hamstring curl, for example, if you're around my size, maybe you could hamstring curl a little over 200 pounds. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe you do a little bit more than that. I don't know. Okay, I haven't done hamstring curl in a while. But if you were to lay on your back and you were to perform a leg press, okay, even someone who isn't very powerful and is much smaller can do a considerable amount of weight on a leg press. I can remember when I was a young boy in the weightlifting gym, maybe 14, 15 years old, I was able to do, I don't know, 700, 800 pounds, something like that. A guy came into the gym and taught me how to use a leg press like the right way. And I was astounded by how much weight I was actually able to lift without really, having done the exercise for very long. You're just incredibly powerful from a position like that. That pushing motion, all right, away from your body is always going to be much stronger than your ability to pull your heels in, okay, the way that you would in a hamstring curl, okay? So normally, we use the hamstring curl to kind of keep our training partner close to us, okay? And we're not going to completely lose the hamstring curl. I still want to pull my heels in, but I'm going to add that pressing motion by stepping on my ankle. It's hard to press when my feet have nowhere to push off of. But when I put one foot on the mat and I step another foot on the ankle, as I drive into my training partner, I can now push off into a break, as opposed to just pulling and holding, okay? Now, I'm not going to say I do this in every single heel hook, but it is a way to increase your power, okay? Not just in heel hooks and other movements as well. You can do this from knee bar situations, and we'll see that later on in the DVD, okay? As far as the middle joint's concerned, I already talked about most of the things that you can do to increase pressure on the middle joint, okay? The bare minimum that you need on the middle joint is you need pressure with your hips into the middle joint that moves the knee outwards like so, okay? The best case scenario would be if you could put pressure in such a way that rotated the middle joint. So you weren't just pushing, but you were adding a rotational force. Okay, why? Because you're applying a rotational force down here at the foot. Okay, so holding it in place is good. Okay, but if you can then turn around the knee, you're going to have even more success. Okay, so you have this post as a possible way to increase force, and then we have a hip turn as a way to increase force. One thing that's relevant to talk about here is the position of your knees relative to the force of an Ashigarami. And this is a really important conversation to have, okay? Wherever my knees are pointing in an Ashigarami, that's typically the direction of force that's being exerted, okay, by my hips, my pelvis, etc. So if I, for example, face my knees up towards the ceiling, I'm not going to do nearly as good of a job at turning my training partner's knee down to the mat because the force is translated upwards. As I drive my pelvis, that's naturally where the force goes, okay? This is one of the reasons why a Rimi Ashigarami doesn't do a great job at breaking, okay? Because my knees tend to point across the opponent as opposed to down on the mat. It's also another reason why we don't tend to favor locking our legs in a figure of 4 inside our training partner's legs for breaking purposes, because this also tends to make our knees point this direction, okay? So one way to increase force when we're breaking is to take our two knees and rotate them around our training partner's knee. Typically at the bare minimum, getting this knee down to the mat is very helpful. This knee also helps though, okay? This knee touches the floor, this knee follows, okay? And you can see now the translation of force into my training partner's knee, okay? So what are we doing to increase our pressure here, okay, at the middle joint? Okay, we're making sure our Ashigarami faces the opposite direction that we're twisting the foot. So we're pointing our knees, both of them. I don't splay them open like this. I'm pointing my knees and rotating my training partner's knee and eventually driving my pelvis into it. Now finally, we reach the end joint, okay, or the lever arm. And we're talking about my training partner's foot. And you might be asking yourself, well, is there anything I can do to increase leverage here? Okay, and yes, you can, okay? We can change our grips, okay? There are a multitude of grips in the sport, and I can cover most of them in this conversation, okay? There's gonna be a few that I don't cover. The first is a 10-finger grip. It's probably, arguably, one of the weaker grips, okay? But at the very least, it creates a hole, okay? There's a lot of space here, okay? I'm not able to pull things very close to me, okay? Notice we use a lot of 10-finger grips, for example, maybe when I reach around someone's waist, especially if they're much bigger than me, especially if an arm's trapped on the inside, okay? Why? We need to be able to reach around a large surface area. It's important for me to be able to have a lot of space. The second thing that grabbing a 10-finger grip does is it adds a high degree of flexibility with your elbows. Okay, so for things like a high elbow guillotine or something, it'd be very easy to manipulate and move my elbows around. Okay, but in general, it creates a lot of space. When I go palm to palm, the space is a little tighter, just a little bit. Okay, the grip is a little bit stronger. Okay, I'm attached to a little bit more. Okay, the flexibility is still pretty good. It's not great. It's not as good as the 10-finger grip where I can totally touch elbows together, etc. Okay? Then I have wrist to wrist. As you can see, this space is shrinking. Okay? When I go into a wrist to wrist situation, things get very tight. The flexibility, however, starts to diminish. Now, as I try to move and manipulate my elbows, I kind of lose the grip. So I only have a certain degree of flex in each direction with a wrist to wrist grip. But it is very strong. It is very tight. Okay, because you see there's a smaller hole here. Finally, we have bicep deep grips, okay, or reverse bicep deep, depending upon what situation you're in, okay, at which point this hole has closed quite a bit, especially as I pinch my elbows in, okay. So this one might be one of the tightest grips that we're going to be able to get in the sport is anytime we're able to reach bicep deep with a fist up like this. Now, understanding those grips, we can apply them on our opponent's foot, okay. And they're used in different ways. I very rarely would break someone with a 10-finger grip. However, it's a very flexible grip, so I might just use a 10-finger grip to get a hold of my training partner's heel initially. All right, why would I do that? Well, when I get underneath my training partner's heel and I try to go palm to palm, try to hide your heel a little bit, it's hard to reach. So maybe I go 10-finger and I turn my training partner a little bit first because I have that flexibility of elbow position. Then I go palm to palm. Okay? And this is a pretty tight grip. Okay? But it's not the tightest grip. Okay? We can go further than this. Every one of these grips is elevating my training partner's heel higher and higher. I can elevate the heel this high. I can elevate the heel even higher. As I go wrist to wrist, I can elevate the heel even higher. As I go figure of 4, not only do I elevate the heel, but I'm also pressing my elbow and shoulder down on my training partner's toes. And this gets exceptionally tight. Okay? And you can even, you go standard figure 4 or reverse. In general, we use reverse. Why? When I use standard, reach my hand, it's easy for my training partner to peel my hands off, right? So, as a general rule of thumb, when we want flexibility, we use more open grips, 10-finger, palm to palm, okay? When we want power, when we want horsepower and tightness, we go wrist to wrist. We go bicep deep or reverse bicep deep, okay? So let's talk about the way that we use these, okay? I mentioned 10-finger being a nice flexible way to expose the heel. Palm to palm being the most used, okay? It's one of the easiest to access, but it's a pretty tight grip, okay? And then finally, moving to a situation where we're wrist to wrist, this would probably be a good synthesis between power, flexibility, control, etc. So most of the time when you see our athletes break someone, we're probably going to go wrist to wrist, okay? Now, when does reverse figure 4 come into play? Now, technically, I could try to lock a reverse figure 4 in right now. Reverse figure 4 comes into play the most as my training partner exposes his heel more. So let's say, for example, let's go back. I'm driving, I'm trying to finish my training partner, and he starts to turn. Turn. All right, and now my knees point towards the ceiling. I mentioned to you that's not a really desirable thing for my outside ashigarami, right? So it's getting harder and harder for me to apply force to my training partner's leg. But now the reverse figure 4 is much easier to lock. So as I find my training partner turns and I'm no longer able to control their turn, I get a wrist underneath my training partner's heel, I grab the bicep and I flex up towards the ceiling. My elbow pushes down towards the toes, my wrist flexes up towards the heel, and remember to use your ashigarami to counteract the rotation of the foot. Don't go with the rotation of the foot, take your 2 knees and point them away. And we get good breaks. You could even roll through and finish your training partner on the far side. It's just hard sometimes to get that reverse figure 4 right here because your training partner's heel is so heavy. So we often wait to get it until when our training partner starts to turn. Okay? So, talking about advanced braking mechanics, at the end of the hip, we can use things to push off of our training partner. At the knee joint, we focus on a pointing of the knees and a rotation and getting our hips up off the ground. And at the end of the foot, we talk about an ability to go from looser grips to tighter grips. And eventually the tightest grip of them all, reverse figure 4. Okay? Now, other than that, I mentioned this in our first conversation, maximizing leverage, okay? Making sure that bicep tries to catch our training partner's toes, okay? One other thing to comment on, okay, is the extension of your entire body. So we've looked at each section of this. We've looked at the feet, okay, how we could stomp on our own foot. We've looked at the knees, how we could turn our training partner's legs. We've looked at our training partner's foot, the different ways that we can grip. Now, finally, there's one element we haven't really discussed, and that's kind of our entire body. Our spine is going to be extending as we try to drive our pelvis in to push on our training partner's knee. We want maximal ability to extend. If I lock into a heel hook and my body is already extended, it's very difficult to finish, okay? Or it's difficult to have a wide follow through. What do I mean by follow through? Let's say I have tension in the heel hook here. I'm going to show you what my follow through is. That's how much farther I can extend past the tension. So what I'd like to do is to create a situation where there's tension while my spine is concave, like a C. If I can create tension here, and my training partner already has braking pressure, now I have so much more follow through. Watch the follow through now. From a different angle. I have so much follow through. Whereas before, when I locked up in an extended position, that's my follow through. I can't go very far back. So the last thing I'll mention to you guys, oh, actually, there's one more after this. I forgot about it. Okay, but one of the last things I'll mention to you guys, okay, is that spinal extension thing. So I start the move by going concave. Okay, my chest and shoulders come close to my training partner, like so. Okay, even my head comes close. Now, as I finish the break, everything goes into extension. I can't even extend very far because it's already so tight. But just imagine, I have this tight and everything comes with me and I extend back. I'm literally tearing limbs off of my training partner at this point. Okay? Comparative to starting in a position like this, I can only hip in a little bit. So, I get concave. Everything creates tension. If there's no tension in the leg yet, you haven't done your job. Make sure your knees are pointing. Make sure you're pushing off of your training partner's hip. Make sure you're lifting and elevating the heel. Make sure you're putting pressure on your training partner's toes. Make sure your ass is off the mat. Okay? Now there's tension. Every inch I extend now is braking pressure. Okay? It's horrible. I'm sure you maybe, I'm not watching Chris's facial expressions, but I'm sure maybe you guys are. All right, it's a pretty terrible thing. I mentioned there was one more thing. I mentioned spinal extension. Your head. Okay? Your head wants to kind of look over your training partner's foot. Okay? So as I go into my extension, my head will wrap around my opponent's foot. And what that does is it helps turn and press my training partner's feet. When your head stays stationary, it's hard to turn the foot. So with a stationary head, I don't get much rotation. My head then rotates ear to shoulder, and I can get some pretty good rotation around my training partner's foot. Okay? So there's a lot of different elements to increasing pressure there on your training partner's leg. Definitely worth reviewing this tape quite a bit. I went over those details a lot, in different situations. It's something you're probably going to have to replay over and over again and practice those different details. I recommend, getting a good drilling partner, sitting there, practicing this repeatedly, asking your training partner, hey, how does this feel? Does it feel tighter? Does it feel looser? You need to do these kind of tests with your training partners to find out exactly what kind of body positioning you need to get your breaks. Just watching it on film is not enough, okay? You guys are really going to need to practice this skill. It's not the same as just learning a move, This is something that piece by piece, you're going to have to add these little elements and see if you can make your heel hook better. You really think you got the chops to break somebody an outside heel hook? Well, we're about to find out. I got the one arm, one leg test for you. Okay, so this is a great way to check on yourself and see if you're kind of doing everything that would be necessary to break somebody. It's very frustrating. Guys, I'm telling you, you guys know Gordon Ryan's one of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. Man, we would spend hours at my academy late at night, him, me, and his brother. And we would work on outside heel hook finishing mechanics. And I would videotape him trying to do the outside heel hook, then his brother, and then me, and we'd be comparing and contrasting, what details are working and what ones aren't. And, so, man, I'm telling you guys, it's a hard skill to develop, for many people. Although, to be fair, Nicky Ryan, got it right away for some reason. I'm not really sure. But Gordon struggled with it, and I struggled with it too. So one great way to kind of check on yourself and see if you're doing everything right, and to help teach you how to do everything right, is to just break somebody with one arm and one leg, okay? So what I'm going to do here is cross my training partner's hip like so with this leg. So it's not a true outside ashigarami, but it's simulating an outside ashigarami. And I'm going to lift up my training partner's heel with this wrist, okay? There's a couple important principles that this is going to teach you, okay? One, it's going to teach you how to pin and control your training partner's hip. It's going to teach you how to use this top knee to clamp down and put pressure on your training partner's knee, okay? And it's going to teach you to elevate someone's heel, because all too often people forget that and they collapse and they lay down on people's legs, okay? We got to elevate, okay? Look how I'm up on an elbow here, okay? So I pin and control my training partner's hip. I press in with my knee and I lift up on the wrist. And maybe, you add a little bit of bicep torque here. I push down with my bicep on my training partner's toes. So all these things at once, I'll do it nice and slow. You're going to see my heel slide in and my knee point, my wrist raise up, and my hips press into my training partner's knee. Okay? And now, are you going to catastrophically break somebody with a one-arm, one-leg drill? Absolutely not. But he should feel enough tension that it's uncomfortable enough for him to be like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to tap. Okay? And that's it. Okay, one arm, one leg. Again, we control the hip, we pinch the knee in, our pelvis drives in, and we lift and raise this wrist, like we're looking at our wristwatch. Okay? I didn't mention this in earlier videos, because I think now it's pretty well known. Don't make the common error of reaching underneath your training partner's leg like so while looking at the palm of your hand. Okay? Even with locked hands, this is a bad idea. All right? Because again, we want to raise the heel. And when your hand is like this, it's hard to raise the heel. Okay? So turn and raise. Turn and pin. Press the pelvis. So we can do this in stages. Watch. 1, 2, 3. We can start up at the foot. 1, 2, 3. Okay, we're good to go. And now we can do it all at once. Okay? And in this way, and then you can take this, so I create tension, right? So there's already tension in the foot as I do this. Before he taps, I don't make him tap, but I create tension. Now look, I join the hands. I join the feet. I lift my ass off the ground. Okay, and then you can add in that final component so that you can get the feel for, okay, here's the one arm, one leg test. There's the theory. Now here's the practice. Me joining everything together and actually locking up my hands and actually breaking my training partner. All right, so we're going to take a look at a little bit of an obscure submission now, used very well by Palhares, called the heel knee bar. He uses it in conjunction with Arimi and outside ashigarami attacks as the opponent turns, okay? So this can be done during my Arimi ashigarami or during my outside ashigarami attacks. Okay, in either instance, okay, whether I'm in Arimi ashigarami or already in outside, and I feel as though my opponent starts to turn, okay, one of our offensive options is to pull our opponent's heel high towards our shoulder, to climb our legs slightly higher, and bow our knee outward, okay, getting into a position where we can knee bar our training partner, all right, by placing our pelvis against my training partner's knee, just above my training partner's patellar tendon, okay, as my knee flares outwards and my body presses up. Notice the heel hook grip still stays in. I can join my hands or I can just support my opposite wrist as I press in like so. And it can either happen with my chest facing towards the ceiling, or as my training partner continues to rotate, I can continue to apply pressure. Okay, come back. All right, let's go back. Let's say we do it from Arimi ashigarami this time. So my training partner turns in a Arimi ashigarami situation. I just take this foot out, cover my training partner. I can also technically lock my legs to the inside if I'd like. I think it makes the most sense if your feet are already on the outside to keep them on the outside. I don't like the idea of making major switches in this position while my training partner is trying to roll away from me. I think it leads to a high degree of slippage. Okay? So I get into this situation. I vice against my training partner's hamstring. There's a point where my training partner's hamstring meets his buttocks, and that's where I'm looking to catch. Okay? If I go too much higher than that, I leave a big space between my knees for my training partner's knee to slide out. okay? So we're looking to perfectly position and press my pelvis into the knee, okay? From here, I'm bridging up, I'm pushing into my training partner. If you want to create a little bit more pressure, I mentioned that adding that foot press, you can do it, but again, it's opening some space for my training partner's knee to come free, okay? So my general recommendation is to lock either a figure four or a semi-senkaku. Whenever I refer to a semi-senkaku, it refers to a situation where I don't lock into my knee, but my knee is slightly raised and my calf muscle presses down. So in this instance, my calf muscle presses down on my ankle, my knee flares out so my pelvis can come up, okay? As I bridge into my training partner's knee, okay? Something that can often happen during this turn is my training partner turns and it starts to become awkward. I'm losing the orientation for the heel knee bar. You can support your training partner's ankle and go right into a lat knee bar if you'd like from this position. Or of course, like we mentioned previously, go ahead. If my training partner continues to move, we always have the ability to switch back to the inverted. Okay, so look at this in a slightly different orientation. I start turning my training partner. Okay, my knee bows out. I go senkaku or semi-senkaku. Okay, I press my hip into my training partner's patellar tendon or slightly higher than that. Okay, if I feel as though my training partner is rolling and the orientation is wrong for the lock, I can switch to a lat knee bar in this position. Or, okay, if I feel like I can't make that switch fast enough, we join two hands on the foot and we move into our inverted heel hook break, okay, like so. All right, back to our original sequence if we're staying put. Your training partner heel knee bar is a nice movement to add to your arsenal. It has been proven to be effective by some of the best in the sport, so by all means, it's something worth practicing. It's not a huge part of what we do because it's kind of a one-off move in a very specific sequence, but it is a very good move. Nicky Ryan used to hit it on me all the time. He was very, very good with it. So try this one out a little bit as your training partner rotates away from you in your Rimi and outside Ashigarami attacks. All right, so there's a certain issue that develops in outside Ashigarami. So part of the reason I'm not going to do a whole section on entries to outside Ashigarami is because it often doesn't make sense to enter into that position for a particular reason. Okay, and that particular reason, we mentioned a little bit earlier in the video, earlier in the DVD, but that reason is that there's a high degree of back exposure and a decent ability for your training partner to come up and crush you from an outside Ashigarami situation. So let's talk about this common problem, all right, that we have whenever we lock up this situation. So all is pretty well so long as I have some sort of submission in place, okay? Typically a turning submission, whether it be toe hold, whether it be heel hook, whatever the case may be. If I have any of those things in place, I'm kind of in good shape. Because in these rotating submissions, my training partner can't sit up and crush me, really, okay? He can't really expose my back because as he tries to take my back, I just turn him, okay? But when we run into problems is when I either have an Achilles lock or I have no lock at all, and I end up in this position. So again, if I just entered into outside Ashigarami at any given point in time, just go and enter, okay? I'm giving my opponent an ability to crush me. And I'm giving my opponent an ability, go back. I'm giving my opponent an ability to, depending on how much I dig for the heel here, go ahead, he slides his knee out, and he takes my back. Okay? So, that's also, by the way, probably relevant to the heel exposure things that we were talking about before. I didn't mention this. I talked about the idea of using Rimi Ashigarami to turn people. Okay? Part of the reason we're doing that is we don't want to get into the habit of digging like this for people's heels, because look at what I'm doing. I'm exposing my legs to attack. I'm exposing my back to attack, right? So we got to be really careful with that. All right, but if we get caught in one of these situations and I don't have my heel hook in, okay, and my training partner starts to come up to crush me, okay, or expose my back, one of the first things that I'm going to do is to fold inward on myself, okay? The more I stay in extension here, the easier it's going to be for my training partner to come up, flatten me out, okay? And no matter what I'm trying to do to dig for that leg, he's going to sprawl out, and I've lost this guy, okay, naturally. So as my training partner starts he's beat me on the leg. Immediately, I fold in and I turn into a ball. I take this hand and I grab my training partner's lat muscle. As my training partner tries to crush me, I push off the mat and I tuck and roll like so. I'm in outside Ashigarami. Maybe I had a heel hook, but I lost it. I feel as my training partner is going to come up into me. Nope. You have to fold over this knee. Sorry. Okay. I fold myself in. I post on my training partner's lat muscle. Okay. And now from this position, I have a couple different options. Okay. I can go to turn my training partner right away, or I can just lock my legs over my training partner's hip and then go into the turn. So I could almost go back into an Arimi Ashigarami, okay, or I can keep my outside Ashigarami and start applying the lock. Recognize, okay, that because we're in a position where our knees are facing the ceiling, remember we mentioned those increased gripping sequences where we can get a better grip on our training partner. It might be a great time for a reverse figure four entry. You don't have to, but it might be a good time, okay, because his chest is facing the floor, mine is facing the ceiling. It's very easy for me to put this on. He can't interfere with my hands. There's no real issues there. Okay, it's a very tight lock, and I can start trying to break my training partner from here. Or I go conventional grip. We finish our roll through. We break our training partner and outside Ashigarami. Okay. Another good option. Okay, as I start to lose the foot, what I don't want to lose is my opponent's knee. Okay. If he starts pulling the knee free, it's very easy for him to come up and take my back now. I can try to grab onto his foot. It's not going to be helpful. Okay, scoot around, scoot around. So, the moment I lose the foot, I scoop around my training partner's knee like so. As he tries to pull his knee free and create back exposure, it's a difficult thing. As he tries to sit up on top of me, I kick into my training partner and splay my legs, knocking his hip down to the floor. From here, I post up and I start turning around my training partner. Now I have a lot of different options from here. I can push into my training partner and I can fall into double trouble situations for knee bars. We'll talk about that at another time when we get to the knee bar section. Or I can sit across my training partner and get into cross Ashigarami situations. Okay? I can go after heel hooks. I can get my double trouble, whatever it is that I want to do. Okay? But this is how we transition and avoid getting our back taken in these situations, all right, we're crushed. Okay, so another option, instead of just folding in on myself, it's a little bit more proactive. I get a hold of my training partner's knee, and I start turning around it. I often scissor my legs first, my knee comes up, and I either sit completely across my training partner, or I barrel into him, and I get a hold of two legs, okay? And we can fall into different submission sequences from here, okay? One last thing. In the first iteration of the move, when I fold it in on myself, okay, as my training partner goes to get on top, and I get in this situation, go back, because we're going to be at an angle where they can't see. Get off me. Thank you. Let's scoot in a little bit. Okay. As my training partner comes in, I fold in on myself. Another good option, nope, don't sit down, stay exactly where you are. Another good option for me here is to continue my turn around my training partner, okay? So as my training partner came on top of me here, I just turn around my training partner, like so, okay? And now there's gonna be a plethora of options for me, okay? If I get my legs locked up on the outside like so, and I place my heel hook in, my training partner rolls, and now I'm in an inverted heel hook action. So let's look at this again. My training partner's crushing me, and I look to over-rotate, okay? As I get into this situation, I push off, I turn, okay? I kick into my training partner, and my legs lock on the outside. From here, I bow my training partner's leg outward, and we lock up. I'll do it one more time because I feel like I left your field of vision. Okay, I score this arm to the inside, I lock up, and I position my training partner's foot to the far side, like so. All right, guys, That's how we deal with back exposure and an opponent trying to flatten us out whenever we get in outside Ashigarami situations and we lose control of the heel. We're going to take a little look at Achilles locks and how they can be used effectively. I made its own section, its own section for Achilles locks specifically for the purpose that you don't really stick to just Arimi Ashigarami or outside Ashigarami. You kind of vary and go into different places. This isn't going to be all-encompassing. There are other ways to use Achilles locks, and we'll discuss that when we get into the other Ashigarami sequences. But I felt as though it kind of deserved its own little subsection so we could talk a little bit about some of the things that we could do with Achilles locks to make them better and some of the different places that we're going to see them. Okay, so let's go over some of the different variations of Achilles locks that we're going to find. So first things first, let's remember our breaking mechanics, a brief review. Okay, my shoulder covers my opponent's toes. Okay, if I look back and I can see the toes, it's no good. Okay, that means I'm not maximizing the lever arm. Okay, my wrist position would be underneath the heel. I make sure that my fulcrum is at the breaking point, right? Okay, and then from here, I always make sure that I have high hands. So throughout this process of anything that I'm going to do, all right, you're probably going to see me doing that. Now, does that mean that there are not variations, okay, of grips that you could be using in these Achilles locks? No, it does not. There are variations. Is this an acceptable Achilles lock grip when I grab my training partner's shin and I grab my own wrist? It is, but just make sure if you're going to do this, that you do it in such a way where your shoulders and hands come high, okay? And they stay in this position while you're breaking. Because like I said, most people, when they lock up like this, at some point in time, they allow their shoulders, hands, everything to droop down and you lose pressure, okay? So that's one good way to control your training partner's ankle. The reason that many people like that or prefer that, okay, is because it stabilizes the shin bone while they're getting a hold of their lock. So I could see some value in that, where when we just lock like so, my training partner can twist and turn his knee in different directions, making it a little bit more difficult for me to control. I could totally see that. Are there variations where people go elbow deep on their Achilles locks? Yes. Again, could it be useful? Is it possible to break your training partner from positions like this? Maybe even locking up in a figure of four, okay, or grabbing my own wrist? Yes, but again, got to be really careful here because when I lock elbow deep, naturally the fulcrum is going to be lower, okay? So I'm going to have to do a really good job of elevating my elbow as much as possible. And you see that even when I do that, the elbow is probably going to be lower than the wrist would be if I was holding like so. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And then the last grip I'll mention to you, and you're going to see this probably later on in the DVD, is a reverse figure four grip. The reverse figure four grip does a good job of combining that strong figure four action that's so tight and keeping the hand high, okay, because the wrist comes up like so. We usually don't use this variation, okay, from Arimi Ashigarami or outside Ashigarami sequences. We usually use it elsewhere, all right, but it could be effective here. I'm not going to say not to do it, okay? So there's a few different variations in gripping sequences. I'm sure there might be more. Again, me personally, I stick mainly with the variation, okay, where my wrist comes underneath. I support my own wrist with my own hand, and I use my shoulder to cover my training partner's toes, okay? I believe this allows me to keep my hands as high as possible, okay? Now, let's talk about some of the foot variations, okay? In Arimi Ashigarami, I could break my training partner, but just like the outside heel hook, I shouldn't break anybody from here. If they're intelligent enough, they're going to clear my feet, okay? If I were to break someone from here, I just have to make sure I keep this foot on the hip to the best of my ability, okay? You're going to see me start to go into a situation where my hands stay high and my shoulder comes back over my training partner's toes, all right? My head is going to follow, and as my pelvis drives forward, raising the fulcrum, my shoulder arches back over the toes, okay? So the lever arm is getting pushed down, while the fulcrum is getting driven up, and I can get into some pretty good breaking sequences from here. Like I said though, chances are your training partner will not tolerate an Arimi Ashigarami from this position. He's gonna remove the foot. When the foot is removed, lift your hips up in the air, there's no break, no matter how much I arch, okay? So one way we can fix this is stepping into our outside Ashigarami situation. Now, we mentioned before that just that step by itself is often a difficult thing to achieve because our training partner often fights the foot and maybe reattacks me, etc. So it might not be the best option, all right, for you guys to just take that out and attack. One way that we also get to this position is when my training partner's busy and occupied with moving this foot. As my training partner's busy and occupied moving this foot, and he goes to try to step or sit over it, that's when I step over my training partner's hip. All right, and it's in this way that my training partner is occupied dealing with some other part of my body that it makes it easy for me to step over. Okay, typically we would wait, go ahead, until my training partner steps over the foot. Now I can step over my training partner's hip. Now there's two variations of what could happen here. I can have my legs locked over my training partner's hip like an outside Ashigarami, or I can have one foot tucked in and one foot over the hip. Again, the key being that we pin down this hip in some way. Okay, let's take a look at that again. Right, if I can get my leg out and cover my training partner and go an outside Ashigarami, great. If I find as though he's disruptive, I'm trying to stop this foot from coming across, and I'm a little bit more vulnerable, I wait until he clears the foot, and I come into a situation like so, where I step over my training partner's hip. Let's talk about the outside Ashigarami variation first. Now, I mentioned to you that back heeling does a pretty good job of controlling and pinning your training partner. All right, so just pulling my heels in with a strong closed wedge around my training partner's hip. Hands high and an arch, and I can break my training partner quite well. And this is much better than the Arimi because you can't step over it. All right? We can also add pressure to Achilles locks the same way that we did with heel hooks through the action of stepping and stomping. Okay? So I can either take the outside Ashigarami position and step on my own chin, or I often find this to be very effective, especially in Achilles locks, we can physically step on the hip. Now, unlike the heel hook, where I worry about stepping on the hip because it gives a lot of space for my training partner to clear the knee, I don't worry about this in Achilles locks because control of the knee is not essential in Achilles locks. And we'll talk about that later. So stepping on the hip, if anything, it's going to add to the submission. I'm able to push down, all right? And now I'm able to drive my pelvis off of a pressing motion instead of a curling motion. Okay, we talked about the power of that earlier in the DVD, okay, when we talked about advanced braking mechanics, okay? And I don't have to worry about him slipping out because we can move to other submissions later. We'll talk about that. So I post on the hip. I place another foot right on top of my own ankle, okay, right here. Okay, and now I press, keeping my hands high, arching over the toes, pelvis forward. We get some really good breaks, okay, from there. Now, same thing is true with one foot underneath and one foot over. We discussed that often he'll pommel that foot off. Maybe I want to use this moment as the time to cross the plane of the hip. From here, instead of locking up outside Ashigarami, I just keep one foot tucked underneath. I keep hands high. I come over with my shoulder. I'm driving my pelvis forward. Technically, in this move, you could also stomp the hip. Okay, this can also increase pressure. All right, now, something interesting is going to start to happen. Okay, as you go to perform these movements, it's often the case that your training partner tries to roll in compensation of the pressure. Okay, so as I'm in an outside Ashigarami, or as I'm in a Rimi, or even this position where we have inside position on the thigh and one leg over. I don't know what to call this, but this is another braking position. In all of these situations, it's often the case that my training partner tries to roll to alleviate pressure. Now, for those of you that are worried about defense, just so you know, while that may save you for a split second, things are about to get a whole lot worse so long as your training partner understands concepts of finishing Achilles locks in belly down situations. Now, yes, my training partner's kind of screwing himself here by going belly down, okay? But I also have to know how to handle the situation. If I maintain the same grips that I have, and I try to finish the Achilles lock like this, and I'm just humping my back on my training partner's leg, we're not going to get anywhere here, okay? You can't really get good power in the submission this way, okay? I don't care if you're an outside, I don't care if you're stomping on the hip, I don't care about any of those things. If you're still holding with two hands on your training partner's Achilles, it's rare that you're going to get the braking pressure you want. It's also a very uncomfortable position. Your face is dug in the mat. You have no structure to work from. Okay, it's not an easy thing to maintain this position. So what we must do is, as my training partner inverts, we relieve one hand and we post it down on the mat. From here,
I splay my knees, okay? If my knees stay together, it's going to be hard to drive my hips into the fulcrum. Remember, that's part of what we're doing to break my training partner. When I try to drive my hips in now, it's all wrong. So my hips widen, like so. And now when I drive my pelvis forward, it's easy to impart pressure on the ankle lock. Now there's one last thing that's important here, okay? I must pop up on this hand. An elbow is good, but it's not good enough. Not to break truly good athletes, all right, that know what they're doing from here. Coming up on a hand is going to become essential. I want as much head and shoulder height as possible, and I want to take that height and I want to translate it into pressure from my hips into my training partner's Achilles tendon like so, okay? And from here, I arch the same way that I normally do. My head comes back. I look over my shoulder to make sure that I'm putting pressure on the lever arm, and I keep that fulcrum driven in to my training partner's Achilles to get a good solid break here. So the position itself, posted hand on the mat, splayed knees, okay? Whatever position I have that ankle lock in, I'm looking over the shoulder, driving the pelvis in and arching back. And I can't wait to see the memes of me doing that solo when you guys are finished downloading this DVD. Okay? Another great opportunity for you guys to get to that inverted position. Stand up, Chris. Anytime you enter into Ashigarami, I mentioned this before, sometimes people try to run out of the move. Whenever someone tries to run overhead, I can roll over my shoulders, pop up, splay the knees, and drive in. Now, I'll say this. Often when you transfer to this inverted Achilles lock situation, one of the problems you'll face is your hand gets a little misplaced and you're back halfway down the calf muscle. You don't really have your training partner. So take your time. Don't just viciously bridge into your training partner's calf muscle. Reposition. Slide your wrist up the Achilles until you hit the breaking point underneath your training partner's ankle, right under the heel. Take the time to put your shoulder in position on your training partner's toes. Fold your elbow inward and then go into your break, as opposed to going for a half-assed version of the move. That time that you take to make this move efficient will make all the difference, okay? Just because you get to an inverted situation doesn't mean you can slack on the braking mechanics. Doesn't mean you can let your wrist drop. Doesn't mean you can't cover the toes with your shoulder, okay? You have to fix all of those things when you're in an inverted position. One last thing, okay? The short Achilles. Okay, so we get into an Achilles lock situation, okay? I had mentioned before that when I stomp on my training partner's hip, and I do that in outside heel hooks, I'm worried that the knee's gonna slip out, etc. And I'm not worried in an Achilles, okay? If my opponent tries to push my leg short and free his knee the same way that he would in an outside heel hook, I can apply pressure on my training partner's knee like so. I vice down onto my other leg, okay? So my calf muscle touches my own, shin, okay? And I'm gonna do that same arching motion. And it's actually very powerful. Why is it so powerful? Because I'm able to hold down the middle joint now instead of the hip, all right? So there's so much less mobility, okay? I'm literally pinning and controlling my training partner's leg here as opposed to the hip, where normally, as I go into my break, there's some movement here in my training partner's ankle. He can bend his knee a little bit. All right, sometimes to get my break, I gotta be able to position myself so that that knee's not gonna move so much. Once I cover the knee, I know for sure it's not moving, and I can put some real pressure. Now, I really like the use of the short Achilles for the purposes of getting my training partner back into a position where I can heel hook him, because his only recourse, all right, for dealing with a short Achilles is going to be to pull himself close. When he pulls himself close, there's my exposure that I wanted, okay? That closeness of the hip-to-hip contact that allows me to go back into some of my other submission holds, okay? You don't have to do that, though. He pulls you up, right? You can always go right back into your regular Achilles locks. You can go into your inversions, etc. One last thing that I didn't note on the inversions, sometimes your opponent doesn't want to invert. I find the inverted Achilles, by the way, to be the strongest one. When your opponent doesn't want to invert and you want to force it, I have to create an arching motion to get my training partner to move. So just bridging into the Achilles sometimes isn't enough. Maybe it's not tight enough, whatever the case may be. I release one hand. This is before I even go inverted. and I arch over my own head and shoulder, and I turn my pelvis towards the floor. And that gets people to turn quite effectively. Okay? So that's a preemptive inversion. Okay? Watch as I apply pressure to the ankle by arching back and looking over my shoulder as I reach and I bridge. Okay?